Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks, Veronica, for having me, and thanks to the whole staff at the Blanton. I'm really excited to be here. It's a lot warmer here than it was in rainy, cold New York when I left yesterday afternoon. So as Veronica mentioned, I am an associate curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at MoMA, but what she didn't mention is that I also happen to have grown up down the street from Ellsworth Kelly, only I didn't really know it at the time. It wasn't until I left home, went to college, and wound up in New York at MoMA that I finally pieced together that where I came from was basically mere steps from the place that Kelly called home since 1970. And then it wasn't until the winter of 2012 that I finally had the occasion to come back home, so to speak, this time in order to meet with Kelly in his studio in the context of an exhibition that I was co-organizing at the museum that Veronica mentioned called the Chatham Series, which was a series of 14 paintings that he made just after having moved to Spencertown, New York, and obtaining a studio in the nearby town of Chatham. Each work in this Chatham series takes the form of an inverted L shape. It is made of two joined canvases, each canvas a monochrome of a different color. The works vary in proportion and palette from one to the next, and careful attention was paid to the size and scale of each panel and the color selected in order to achieve a balance and contrast between the two. Research for the exhibition brought me to the studio. I showed up one day with a loaf of bread in hand from the local bakery and was warmly welcomed into Ellsworth's world. He took me to his former Chatham studio, here you can see an image of it, and he showed me how the L shape that he developed for the series, in fact, was inspired by the intersection of the tall windows of the Chatham space, which you can see here on the facade, and the interior dropped ceiling beams on the inside. So standing in that space, looking at these architectural details, I understood physically what I had been taught to understand intellectually. That though much of Ellsworth Kelly's art is obdurately, resolutely abstract, it always has its origins in what he sees, in perceptions as opposed to concepts. In the case of the abstract L shape was a translation of a detail that he saw in the world around him. And so in that kind of moment that our worlds converged for a moment, considering our shared geographical proximity, I fully began to understand the importance of place for Kelly. But Kelly, of course, himself had first understood the importance of place more than 60 years earlier. A quarter century before moving to the tiny town of Chatham, Kelly spent 6 pivotal years in the bustling metropolis of Paris, which he would call home from 1948 to 1954. It is here that he developed the singular abstract vocabulary of line, form, and color that would come to define his singular contribution to the history of post-war American art. But before I get into all of that, let's just take a moment to reacquaint ourselves with Kelly, a figure who by now is, of course, so familiar through the work here on UT Austin's campus and in the Blanton's permanent collection, but whose biography might not be at the forefront of our minds. So just a very brief refresher. Kelly was born in May 1923, in fact, just 2 weeks from today, if I'm doing the math right, in Newburgh, New York, which is about an hour north of Manhattan. His family moved around a bit throughout the tri-state area as a child, but eventually settled in New Jersey, where Kelly finished high school. Here you can see him making character drawings for 5 cents as a student. He then studied art at the Pratt Institute for 2 years in Brooklyn before being inducted into the Army in 1943. And as Veronica mentioned, he served in the Ghost Unit, and I really encourage you to come back. I want to come back to hear the talk about this really super fascinating topic. The Ghost Unit was a special force in the U.S. Army where troops impersonated other Allied soldiers in order to deceive the enemy. So here you have an image of him with a burlap Jeep, which may or may not have been a real Jeep. In 1944, his unit was sent to France, first to Normandy, and then Brittany, and then in the fall of that year to a town just north of Paris for a few weeks, which is how he was first able to visit the French capital. As it turned out, his time served him. 2 years after his return from France, he used the funds available to him as a veteran from the GI Bill in order to study art. First at the School of the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, where among the faculty that he learned from was Max Beckmann and Philip Guston, and then in Paris, which is how he got himself back to France, but this time to stay for a spell. Kelly arrived in Paris in October 1948, bags in hand. He took lodging at the Hotel Saint-Georges on Rue Bonaparte, indicated by the blue star here on the map. Within 6 months, he would move to the Hotel de Bourgogne on the right bank, where he would stay for 3 years. In this moment in Paris's history, the left bank, or Rive Gauche, had become home to leftist intellectuals and bohemian artists, while the right bank, or Rive Droite, was the site of bourgeois high culture. In time, this would change, and eventually the once strict hierarchical distinctions would loosen as fashion houses moved leftward and alternative art spaces moved rightward, for example. But it was certainly circumstances that led Kelly to take lodging on the right bank. An apartment was available to him there. But it is interesting, nonetheless, maybe to just think about what this might have meant at this particular moment in time. And equally, sort of sociopolitically, it might be also interesting to think about the kind of Parisian cultural landscape during this period. World War II had forced a mass exodus throughout Europe, and as a result, in the years just after the war, New York City swelled with European émigrés, including artists, dealers, and intellectuals whose cosmopolitan influence helped to reinvigorate the city's post-depression cultural climate. European artists made meaningful contact with their American counterparts in places like Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery in Midtown Manhattan. And this exchange of ideas was critical in determining the direction that their art would take. But it also marked the start of the shift of the center of the artistic avant-garde from Europe, where it was born, and Paris, where it thrived, to New York. However, Paris, somewhat shaken by the effects of the war, saw an influx of American artists, many of whom were also taking advantage of the GI Bill, like Kelly. These American visitors looked to those who stayed and made meaningful contact with them where they could. The list of those that Kelly made is long and includes many of the pivotal figures of the original avant-garde, so to speak, such as Marc Chagall, Francis Picabia, Georges Van Tongerloo, and Alexander Calder, to name but a few. Still, it's important to keep in mind that the Paris that Kelly came to in 1948 was no longer that of its pre-war heyday. Gradually supplanting the artistic avant-garde was an intellectual one helmed by existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus. Through novels and treatises, their questioning of humankind's place in the universe permeated a European culture now in a state of rebuilding. Within a month of his arrival, Kelly enrolled himself at the École des Beaux-Arts, where as part of the curriculum he was required to sketch from nude models in the classical academic tradition. But Kelly preferred to be out of the classroom and instead in the world, in the grand halls of the Louvre, or admiring the architecture in Romanesque and Gothic churches, or simply wandering the streets, observing, photographing, sketching. This activity is at the heart of what happened to Kelly during his time in France. He found a way to abstraction through the side door of the observable world around him. All of the stuff of his adopted home in France provided an endless bank of images or references. A brick wall, a window, a door, a tree branch, a shadow on a staircase, the reflection of light on the Seine. All of these images became fair game, and here I'm showing you just a few examples of the photographs that Kelly took of these natural and architectural details. But I mean fair game not simply for depicting things as they exist in nature or trying to interpret them through a composition, but instead as formal points of departure, as images that Kelly then took to task, trying to capture their quality or their underlying essence. And he did this largely by leaving his own hand out of it, in an effort to communicate as effectively as possible this quality without getting in his own way, to remain anonymous, as he would later describe of this ambition. The artist is present, first and foremost, through the action, not through the action of a painterly brushstroke, say, but through the primary action of looking, and of looking at things often unnoticed. And in fact, it was through this looking that Kelly found a new way of looking. One of the sites that Kelly visited was, of course, Notre Dame, and here you can see a photograph that he took of its facade in 1949. I mention it specifically because, to me, now this image takes on a new elegiac dimension considering recent events. I wonder how Kelly would have felt about the devastating fire that ravished the cathedral. I happened to be there last week, and it's pretty intense. But I would imagine he would be in mourning, as we all are. At one point, Kelly sketched the ceiling vaults of Notre Dame's interior in ink on paper, and then ultimately turned the sketch upside down in order to look at it instead as something of a plant-like form. As Kelly later recalled, quote, "I remember that when I was about 10 or 12 years old, I was ill and fainted, and when I came to, my head was upside down. I looked at the room upside down, and for a brief moment, I couldn't understand anything until my mind realized that I was upside down, and I righted myself. But in the moment that I didn't know where I was, it was fascinating. It was like a wonderful world." So what is revealed, to me at least, in this little anecdote is an important step in Kelly's process toward his understanding of the translation of things he observed in the world to a two-dimensional flat surface. The same process that he would deploy in the Chatham Series 20 years later, and really in most of the rest of his work since this time. Here, simply upending an image transformed it into something else. He also developed other strategies for turning seen things into art things. Sometimes this meant taking a crop, reducing a sketch of a thing down to its barest, most essential elements. And you can see this strategy at play in this small painting, Window 1 from 1949. Or, and this is perhaps the most radical strategy, sometimes this meant simply taking a one-to-one index of a thing, as he did here in what he considers to be his first significant work of the Paris period. This work, Window, Museum of Modern Art, Paris, now in the collection of the Centre Pompidou, is neither a representation of a window nor an abstraction of a window, but is instead a concrete, objective manifestation of a specific form. It is made of two painted canvases, one of which is placed behind wooden bars in the lower register, so that the two panels are not on the same plane, like this, just as window panes that slide past each other to open would not be. Of course, these are opaque painted panels, not transparent glass, which undermines the essence of a window, right, to let light in, and serves as a kind of sly reminder that what you're looking at is, in fact, an artwork. And in their opacity, they also perform the important operation of deleting their reference function. They no longer reveal the world, but conceal it. Here you can sort of see, I just want to show you the source image, the source material, the windows on the facade of the Museum of Modern Art of the city of Paris, and also on the right in an image that Kelly took of the window himself. As Kelly later described, quote, "Instead of making a picture that was an interpretation of a thing seen, or a picture of invented content, I found an object and presented it as itself alone." This was the true breakthrough for Kelly. With this work, he made the argument that every form that is visible in the world is suitable as an object for an artist to create. This meant to him that he no longer had to invent content nor paint images. He could simply select the form of an object from within the visible world, reduce it, and recreate it exactly. So here, in this context, I'd like just to take a tiny detour by mentioning the ready-made as defined by Marcel Duchamp and championed by others. The idea of taking something from the world and presenting it as an art object has a long and studied history, beginning with Duchamp in the teens. Of course, Duchamp made an important, if scandalous, gesture in 1917 when he turned a urinal on its side, signed it with the pseudonym R. Mutt, and called the result art. But here, Kelly's project perhaps aligns a bit more with what Duchamp called the assisted ready-made, and specifically one called Fresh Widow, though research shows that Kelly was probably not aware of the work at the time that he made his own window. Still, it seems perhaps interesting and worth mentioning, worth considering, if not belaboring, the kind of points of interaction between Duchamp's and Kelly's opaque windows in this regard. But anyway, back to Paris. Another significant thing happened here, which is what helped him push the arguments he was developing in new directions. In June 1949, Kelly met John Cage and Merce Cunningham, two American figures crucial in the development of a new language for music and for dance, respectively, who upended traditional notions of their mediums and instead looked to quotidian experience and the real world and the real objects within it for inspiration. The two happened to be staying in the same hotel as Kelly for a while, and when Cage came to Kelly's studio, the two began an important dialogue about chance, a strategy at the center of Cage's music compositional strategy. Kelly took the lessons learned from their talks to heart and began to incorporate chance into his own practice. He had been aware of the ways in which chance operations had figured into the work of the Surrealists in Paris in the 1930s and was and would be in dialogue with some of the movement's key figures. Yet, through this encounter with Cage, something clicked, and Kelly became interested actively in trying to deploy chance in his own work. The other critical figure for Kelly in this context was Jean Arp, who he met the following year in 1950. Arp talked Kelly through his own engagement with chance, which resulted in a series of exercises that Kelly made involving compositions of the random landings of scraps of paper tossed into the air. And here you can see on the left a work made in this way. He purportedly threw a piece of paper up in the air and then composed the scatterings of the paper. This approach follows a project, specifically a project that Arp undertook in the 19-teens in a group of Dadaist collages, such as the one on the right, where he ripped up the piece of paper, threw it in the air, let the scraps fall, and then allegedly glued the scraps exactly where they landed to a support. But ultimately, Kelly would make a more complex and sophisticated investigation of chance in many paintings that followed. But he would also continue to rely on Arp as an important interlocutor. In 1951, Kelly conceived of a book project called Line, Form, Color as part of a bid for a fellowship from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. He had been teaching art to French school children at this point, and in this context, he had gotten the idea to produce what he described as, quote, an alphabet of plastic pictorial elements. Comprising 40 uniformly sized drawings, it explored passages of straight and curved lines, formations of individual shapes, as you can see here, and combinations of usually 2 to 3 colors plus black and white. Arp agreed to serve as Kelly's reference for the application and wrote a letter in support of it, although the application was rejected at the time. Finally, in 1999, Kelly completed the book and published it. Now, returning to chance, throughout his time in France, Kelly had the occasion to travel, sometimes through chance encounters and sometimes through planned events with those close to him. The scope, location, and duration of each trip varied, but consistent throughout his travels was the fact that each new site in the country offered a new set of aesthetic possibilities. For example, in the summer of 1950, Kelly went to stay at the summer home of the in-laws of his good friend and fellow American Jack Youngerman, the parents of the French actress Delphine Seyrig, in the town of Merce on the west coast at the Seyrig's villa named La Combe. Kelly photographed the light hitting the staircase and at the villa, and used this as an inspiration for a group of 4 paintings for which he translated the motif of the shadows on the staircase into 2 dimensions without attempting to achieve a sense of depth or to convey visual distortion when rendering the 3-dimensional staircase into one plane. Here, chance determined the source image, the way the shadows were cast on the staircase at the precise moment that Kelly photographed it. There are countless other examples of the way that is in which he is engaging with chance in this moment, but another important and distinct entry point for chance to come into Kelly's approach happened during the following summer back in Paris, when he was staying in the dormitories at the University of Paris. He had a dream that he made a large mural, quote, composed of square panels on which we painted black bands with huge brushes. To replicate the qualities of the dream painting, Kelly produced a study of brushed ink strokes across the sheet of paper, then cut the resulting drawings into 20 squares, and randomly recomposed the drawing by shuffling the squares before he glued them onto a support in a grid pattern, retaining the horizontal orientation of the brushstrokes. He then translated the individual squares of the drawing into individual painted canvas, which is what you can see here. Each panel, each of the 20 panels is an individually painted panel, and then attached all of the panels together. This was his first multi-panel painting. The discoveries made in these first years, both in terms of indexing the world and allowing for chance to play a strategic role, all converged in what Kelly later considered to be the most significant artwork that he made during his time in Paris, Colors for a Large Wall. A breakthrough in terms of scale and approach, Colors for a Large Wall is a massive multi-panel painting composed of 64 individual 1 square foot monochrome canvases arranged in an 8x8 panel grid. Apart from this structural decision, Kelly left the work's compositional organization largely to chance. Like other investigations made in this moment, this one is derived from a collage that is made of cut squares of bright, glossy colored paper sheets backed with an adhesive gum that were typically used in French art classrooms. So likely Kelly would have been familiar with these materials or even used them in his capacity as a teacher. Kelly made the study using scraps left over from a series of collages, 8 of them, I'm showing you 2 here, that he had recently completed, titled Spectrum Colors Arranged by Chance. In these colored papers, he found a means of capturing what he described as the quality of light flickering across the surface of the Seine that he could observe from his hotel window, in a way that both resisted a recapitulation of earlier color theory-reliant pointillism and invited the crucial element of chance to come into play. This breakthrough for Kelly gave rise to a group of multi-panel monochrome paintings that tested various arrangements of smaller numbers of colored units. In this one, there are 5 units, for example. In all of the works, the role of drawing is entirely removed from the surface of the canvas. The only lines visible are the literal borders of the panels. Absent any incident, absent any depicted or represented figure, and rather than attempting to simulate 3-dimensional perspective, the multi-monochrome panels become kind of surrogate figures in themselves against the ground of the white wall that they hang on. In this way, then, the painting engages the architectural space that it inhabits, with the space between the viewer and the work becoming an active area for viewing. The wall becomes as integral a component to the composition as the painting itself, the space behind and around it as important as the space occupied by the painting. And here are just a few more examples of the several works that test these possibilities in numerous ways. Here, Kite 2 has 11 panels. The white panels in between the colored ones are single panels, and the colored panels are 2 panels, a colored panel on top of a joined to a black panel. And then here is just one more. This one has 5 panels, but the panels are arranged in a square, in a square format instead of vertically flanking each other to form a row as the others. There are so many stories that one could tell of Kelly's productive stay in France, from his many visits to other European cities that were easily accessible, from his Parisian perch to the first single-panel monochrome that he made after visiting Monet's studio in Giverny, where he encountered the later work of the older artist, who was by then deceased 20 years. At this time, in history. The paintings made by Monet in the last years of his life were widely critically considered to be the kind of pathetic output of an aging, half-blind, once great Impressionist painter. So here, but not so for Kelly. Here you can see in the surface of Kelly's painting a much more painterly treatment, directly inspired by the profound experience, at least in the way that he described it, of being in the studio surrounded by these forgotten, overlooked works. He painted this abstract picture that mixed green and blue with visible, feathered brushstrokes that recalled shadows flickering underwater. A marked departure from his typically monochrome, resolutely anonymous approach to handling paint. Kelly had never done anything like it before and never would again. Interestingly, it was at this time that the late work of Monet was just beginning to be reconsidered critically on the other side of the Atlantic. Monet's large, nearly abstract, all-over, mushy compositions, maybe, of lily pads on his property at Giverny gained new significance in the context of the equally large, abstract, all-over compositions that the abstract expressionist painters were making in New York. But of course, Kelly didn't know too much about these goings-on, what with living in relatively insulated world of Paris, against the backdrop of what I was explaining earlier was this sort of the beginning of this transfer of the avant-garde from Europe to New York in this period. Kelly's first encounter with Abex came by accident, so the story goes. One day, in mid-1954, in a Paris bookshop, Kelly stumbled upon a copy of Art News, which had featured images of the work of Ad Reinhardt in a review of a recent show of his at the Betty Parsons Gallery in New York. Feeling a kind of kindred sensibility with Reinhardt's anonymous abstract compositions, paintings that investigated pure pigment and minimized the artist's hand, you can't really see in this ugly black rectangle, but it does all of that. He began to think that perhaps there might be a receptive audience for his work back home. So, again, the story goes, he packed up his art, dismantling the 64 panels of his Colors for a Large Wall and boxing them up in the process, and returned with the whole shebang back to the United States. Back in New York, Kelly had his work cut out for him. At the suggestion of an American friend in Paris, Kelly took a studio at 109 Broad Street in Lower Manhattan. He also took a job as a mail sorter during the nights to support himself, but he struggled. That summer, Alexander Calder paid him a visit. As I mentioned earlier, the two had met in Paris, and Calder was impressed by the work that he was making here in New York, and by the end of the year, when Kelly was struggling to make his rent, Calder offered to cover the costs. Also, significantly, he offered to write a letter on Kelly's behalf to Alfred H. Barr, Jr., the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art. Here you can see this terrific letter in the MoMA's files of Calder championing his young friend Kelly, in which he writes, "Dear Alfred, I have just seen the paintings of a young ex-GI painter recently returned from Paris, and I said I would write to ask you to visit him. He is Ellsworth Kelly." Calder and Kelly remained lifelong friends, and Kelly would visit Calder in his home in Roxbury, Connecticut, on and off over the coming decades. 2 years after Calder's generous overtures in 1956, Kelly gifted to Calder a painting called Charmette I, which is a black and white painting, as you can see, depicting the way Kelly had recalled the way that the sunlight projected shadows through the trees in the eponymous southeastern French town where he had spent some time. So you see, here Kelly's time in France comes back pointedly and continuously throughout his career. Here, though, he's filtering his translation of the observed world onto the canvas through his own memory of a specific place. So memory is an additional kind of element at play. So who knows in what ways this might have affected the composition. Memories, sketches, or ideas born of Kelly's time in France would continue to impact the work made in the time since in myriad ways. And here's just one other example of this, the great white plaque, bridge arch, and reflections in MoMA's collection, which is based on a sketch that Kelly made while living in Paris, but which he did not fully execute until he came back to New York. So in one way, one could say that Calder served as the initial matchmaker between Kelly and MoMA, but it was, of course, the merit of Kelly's work that captivated the institution and initiated what would become a productive and symbiotic relationship between the two. The story of Kelly and MoMA unfolds in many layers. First, correspondence in the museum files reveal that after reading the letter from Calder, Barr, not wanting to make the trip all the way downtown from Midtown, instead asked Kelly if he could just, deliver some of the paintings up to his office. Things definitely worked differently back then. But Kelly, to his credit, kind of boldly explained, look, guys, these are big paintings. No. So instead, great pioneering curator Dorothy Miller came down to the studio to have a look instead. This meeting would prove to be a fateful one because it resulted in Kelly's inclusion in Miller's landmark exhibition, 16 Americans, in 1959. Along with Kelly, this show introduced American audiences to the work of fellow artists Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, as well as to the black paintings of the then, I believe, just turned 20-year-old Frank Stella. In that show, Kelly exhibited 6 paintings. Here you can see 3 of them, all made in New York in the years since his return from Paris. So they're canvases that signaled a new direction from his foundational period in France, but certainly were indebted to the discoveries he made during it. These paintings were all single panels with compositions of curved silhouette shapes, as you can see in the image here. In these years, Kelly had moved from Broad Street, down the block, to Coenty Slip, where he lived and worked with a tight-knit group of artists and friends, including Jack Youngerman, with whom he was close in Paris, Robert Indiana, Agnes Martin, James Rosenquist. Here you can see a group of these figures cavorting on the roof of Coenty Slip in this kind of iconic image by Hans Nemeth. The open skies of the New York harbor visible from his spot on Coenty Slip, the streets paved with stone blocks used for whaling ships' ballasts, and the elevated train tracks, etc., they all became new compositional fuel. And just as he'd used the shapes of Parisian architecture in his earlier paintings, the details of the buildings of Lower Manhattan and even the arches of the nearby Brooklyn Bridge appeared in his work during this period. Here you can see a work in MoMA's collection that is directly taking that source as a point of departure. Flash forward about 10 years to 1968. The exhibition, The Art of the Real, has just opened at the Museum of Modern Art, introducing audiences to trends in op, pop, and hard-edged work of the then present and recent past. This show, organized by outside critic and Professor E.C. Goosen, sought to bring together works of art that did not, according to Goosen, quote, strive to be realistic, i.e., like the real, but to be as real in itself as the things we experience every day, the things we see, feel, knock against, and apprehend in normal physical ways. So one could perhaps not imagine a better context for Kelly's work than a show like this, and indeed Colors for a Large Wall was included in that show. After the exhibition's close, however, Kelly made a rather bold and surprising gesture when he offered the Museum of Modern Art this painting as a gift. During his years in Paris, he had had only one solo show at the then new Galerie Arnaud in 1951, and was included in a small handful of group shows in France and abroad during this period. But by the late 60s, at mid-career, Kelly was well established and well collected, yet there were no other paintings from Kelly's time in France in the collection of any major institution. The gesture of his having offered this work to the museum might be seen then, in a way, as a gentle nudge to the institution, and by extension to the art world at large, like, hey, look at this important body of work for what it is. It was a bit of a slow burn, But by 1992, the National Gallery of it's a slow burn. But by 1992, the National Gallery of Art, in collaboration with the Jeu de Paume in Paris, organized a major survey of Kelly's years in France. It and its brilliant catalog, with an extensive essay by Yves Lambois, initiated a broader reconsideration of this period and resulted in several works eventually making their way into institutions. And it's not, I mean, I'm oversimplifying slightly, like a work here and there. The Kite 2, I think, that I showed you earlier was acquired in sometime between 1968 and 1992, but you get the point. The Museum of Modern Art now counts 5 major paintings from this period in its collection, and some 20 works on paper, plus the entire set of 40 drawings for the line form color book that I mentioned earlier. And in the decades since, the museum has worked very closely with Kelly to ensure that our holdings is as kind of robust and comprehensive as it can be, tracing the arc of the entire career. And the number of holdings now numbers in the hundreds. I'd like to end by bringing us right back to where we started, to the topic of place. The topic of place generally, and to the place where we find ourselves now specifically. If the project Kelly developed in Paris was to translate place into image, then we might think about this incredible chapel here on campus as a kind of doubling or squaring of that project, of translating place into image and then image back into place. To create the chapel, Kelly first abstracted from the world, and of course we can see the specific world of France coursing through the chapel, from its Romanesque layout to its rose window to its miraculous play of light and color. But extending beyond his two-dimensional work, Kelly managed to kind of reconstitute a world inside the chapel, making it perhaps the grandest summation of the themes and topics of Kelly's life's work. You are all very lucky to be able to live with it and to be able to live within that world. Thanks so much.